In this demo, I want to go ahead and take a look at Node.js to build the web server, and I want to build a really simple web server. And in conjunction with building that really simple web server that we're going to use to serve up HTML pages, I want to look at the file system library that's built into Node.js. And the reason I want to use these two things together is because our web server is going to be serving content from HTML pages that we build. So it's going to be important that we're able to read from those various HTML pages. So it's important that our web server is going to be able to read that data. Okay, so to kick things off, I have a file here that I'm going to go ahead and save on my desktop. So I'm going to save this file on my desktop in a new folder called Node Files. And I'm going to call this file our app.js. Okay, app.js being kind of our starting point. This is where our web server is going to live. So again, to create a really simple web server, I'm going to need the HTTP library. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in the HTTP library. And then the HTTP library has a method called createServer that takes a function definition. The function definition is going to have two incoming parameters, a request and response. So we have a function definition that takes a request and response. Okay, and then we want to be able to output our content. So our content, let's just for now have our content equal hello world. We want to be able to output that content, so we're going to say response.write our content and response.end. And then in addition to that, we want to be able to define which port our server is running on. So we're going to have it running on port 3000. So right now I have this server.listen, and what's going to happen is I'm going to create a variable for that server, and then I'm going to listen on port 3000, and then I'm going to give some kind of indication that this web server is running. So I'm going to have just a prompt on the screen saying listening on port 3000. Okay, and then the idea here is that if I go out to my terminal window and I'm on my desktop, I need to move into that Node Files directory. That's where our app.js file is. And I can go ahead and run that app.js. I'm listening on port 3000. So if I come out to my browser window, I can go to localhost port 3000 and see hello world there. That's the content that I'm serving up. Okay, this is not a very realistic example with our web server. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to create a new file called files.js. And the idea with the files is I want to interact with the file system, and I'm just going to show you what we can do with this. So I'm going to have a text file, dummy.text. Okay, so this is our dummy text file. Here is some content from our dummy text file. Okay, so that's saved. I'm going to go ahead and close it. What I want to do is I want to, within this JavaScript file, I want to read the content from dummy.text. Okay, in order to do that, I have to deal with the file system. So I'm going to have a variable that's going to bring in that file system object. Okay, this is a Node.js library that we can use. And we're going to have a file name, which is dummy.txt. So that's our file name that we want to read. And then the file system object has a method called readFile. It takes two parameters. The first one is which file do you want to read, so our file name. And then the second is a callback when we have actually read the file. It's a callback function. The callback function takes two parameters, an error, and then assuming there is no error, a second parameter which would be our data that gets populated, the data being the data from the file. So we're going to have two parameters, an error and a data parameter. and we're going to look and see if there's an error. And if there is, then we're going to go ahead and just log the error. If there's not, then we're going to log the data from the file. Okay, that's the idea here. And our data from our file, just remember, is here's some content from our dummy text file. That's the idea, is what we'd like to see. So in order to run that, I'm going to use node and then files.js. And what you'll see is I have data, but the data comes in the form of a buffer. And if I go out to the Node API, I'll see that buffer object, and I can get information about the buffer object, but essentially it's an array of bytes. The good news is that buffer object has a toString method that I'm going to invoke, and then I can go back over to my terminal, and we can execute that, and you can see I get the content from that file. So here's some content from our dummy text file. So we're able to read from that file. Okay, life's good there. Why this is important and how it relates to our web server is, let's go ahead and create a new file, index.html. And it's an HTML page, so I'm going to use the HTML template that's built into Atom. And I'm going to say HTML from served from Node.js. And then I'll just have an h1 tag that says, the Cubs stink. Okay, so this is my HTML file. I want to serve it up from Node.js. So now if I go back to my app.js, my content here can be a little bit different. Okay, the way I'm going to set up my content is I want my content to be derived from me reading a file. Okay, so I'm going to have to include the file system again by requiring it. So I bring in that file system object. And I have content there, but what I really want is a file name. So I have that variable. And I can take that file system object and call that read file method, passing in the file name and my callback again. And what I want to do is I want to write in the callback. And instead of writing out my content, I'm going to write the data's toString, and then I'm going to end. One additional thing I might want to do is I might want to write a header saying that this was okay and that the response type is HTML, so I can use that response. There's a write head method that tells me what's the status code, so 200, everything's okay, and then the content type, which would default to the correct content type, but I'm going to be explicit about it here and say that I'm outputting HTML. Okay, so we have hello world getting served up on port 3000, but now we're going to shift over to our terminal. We're going to run our server, so we're going to use node app.js. So we're listening on port 3000, and now what you'll see is I get that HTML page that I'd created. I'm reading from the file system, I'm reading the content of that HTML page, and then I'm serving that up to my clients. Okay, so we have a really basic web server right now. We could expand this as far as we want. If I look at this request object, the request object actually includes a URL. And with the URL, what I could do is I could have conditionals saying, hey, if the URL is just a /, then serve up index.html, serve up the default page. If the URL is admin, then serve up admin.html. Okay, so I could have all sorts of conditionals for each of the different URL paths that I want to define. However, I'm going to avoid that. And the reason why I'm going to avoid that is because there's better ways to handle that. This method would end up looking like a mess for all the different paths unless I have just one or two paths. And the better way to do that is with the Express library. which we'll dig into deeper. But for now, I'm leaving this web server kind of real basic. And I want to jump back to my files demo. Okay, so I'm jumping back to my files demo. One thing we should know about Node is that for every method that is going to take this kind of callback mechanism, where I'm reading a file, when I'm done reading the file, then I have this callback that I can implement where I get the data. That's an asynchronous method that's built on callbacks. Alternatively, I could use a synchronous method. Okay, and I'm going to show you an example of that. So let's say I want to know what the content is, and the way that will work is there's a read file sync method. And the way the sync method works is it just takes a file name and returns the content. And then I should be able to log the content. Okay, so skipping back over to my terminal, Command Control C to exit out of my previous application, and now I can run that files.js file. And you'll notice I end up with the same exact content, whether I'm reading it synchronously or asynchronously. So all of the methods that we're going to deal with files, so we're going to read from a file, we're going to append to a file, we're going to rename a file, we're going to delete a file. All of these methods have both a synchronous and asynchronous method. So unless you have a specific reason why you're waiting on the response, so maybe I can't go on until I have the content, maybe I'm going to parse this content, and I have a specific reason why I'm waiting on it, all of the methods should be called asynchronously, unless, again, you have a very good reason to not do it that way. Okay, so moving on, we have our file. There's some dummy text in it. I want to add some new text. New text. Here is some new text. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to append that to my file. So I'm going to go to the file system, and there's an append file method. And again, it takes a file name, and then it takes my new appended text, my new text. And then there's a callback that is going to alert me of any errors. Okay, so if there is an error, console.error, and IntelliSense failed me there. I'm just going to go ahead and log that error message. Okay, so I want to append my new text. Skipping back over to the terminal, I want to run that command, and now you'll see in that dummy text file, I get that new text. I'm able to append to it. So my application is able to write some new text. Okay, alternatively, if I get rid of that new text, right, so it's gone. Alternatively, I could have used the synchronous method. It's going to take the file name and my new text. Okay, so that should also work. So I should be able to run this, and then we should see in dummy.txt that it is appended back in there. So there's the synchronous and asynchronous method for appending to our file. We might want to be able to rename our file. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and have a new file name, renamed file.txt. So we have our new file name. The way we're going to rename files is there's a method to rename a file. So rename. And the way it works is we take our old name, so which is file name. We take our new file name. And then, assuming that it worked, great. But if it didn't, we're going to get an error object back. And then we can use that kind of same logic where if there's an error, we're going to log it. Okay, so we go ahead and save that. We're going to skip back over to our terminal window. We run it again, and you'll notice that now, if I'm looking at my project, I have this file that's called renamed file because we renamed it. Okay, I'm going to change it back. And I want to right click and I want to rename this dummy. Okay, so we're back in files. Again, being consistent and thorough, we want to look at that synchronous version as well. So there's a rename sync that takes an old file name and a new file name. Okay, and if we head over to our terminal, we're able to run this, and we should see that we have that renamed file again. Okay, so we're able to rename files. And then I'm going to change it back again to dummy.txt. Okay, so I have that file. The last thing that I want to do with our file is I want to be able to, well, actually two things. I want to be able to create a new file. So let's say I don't have dummy.txt. I guess I didn't need to rename it. So let's go ahead and delete it for the time being. Okay, so it's gone. I have some new text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that file system object to write to a file. And the way this works is it takes a file name. It takes some content that I want to write to it. And then it'll take an error object where we can kind of do that same type of error handling that we had done before. Okay, so if I go ahead and run this right now, we don't have that dummy.txt. I'm going to go ahead and run it. We're going to see our new content in there, and we'll see dummy.txt. Here's our new text. So we're able to write our file. We could also write this file synchronously. So there's a write file sync that takes a file name and it takes content. And again, this is predicated on the fact that we wouldn't have this file, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. Okay, so now we're writing the file synchronously as opposed to asynchronously. If I go ahead and run it, you'll see that that dummy text file is there again with this exact same content. So being consistent and thorough, we're able to write to our file system. And then lastly, we want to be able to delete files. So maybe we temporarily write to the file system, we're saving information there, and then after we're done with it, we want to remove it. So again, two methods, both the synchronous and asynchronous version of removing files. To remove a file, so we want to remove dummy.txt. I'm going to go to the file system, and then there's an unlink method. The unlink method is going to take two parameters. It's going to take the file that I want to remove, so the file name, and then again it's going to take that callback, which will notify me if there's an error. So unlink is kind of our delete, if you will. I'm going to skip over to the terminal. I run this, and you'll notice that dummy.txt is no longer there. So I'm able to unlink the file. And now if I manually recreate it, okay, so the file's there. If I manually have it recreated, the file exists, I can go out to the file system, and then there's an unlink sync method that's just going to take my file name. Okay, and then I should be able to head back over, run it, and you'll notice that it gets removed. Okay, and then it's still here in Node.js, so it's removed from my project folder, but it's also it's an open window in Node.js saying, hey, you know, that file doesn't exist on the file system because I've unlinked it or I deleted it. And Node.js is saying, hey, I still think it's here. You have this file. Here was the file name. When I close it, it's going to say, hey, that file doesn't exist. You want to save it. Okay, and I don't need to save it. Okay, so we're working with the file system library in Node.js. We're hitting a lot of the main methods. So reading files, writing files, appending files, removing files. Those are kind of the main methods that we're going to see from the file system. And how that correlates is if you really think about what's going on with the web server, we're able to read files and serve those files up. So we did that with an HTML file. So if we go, let's go ahead and clear this. If we go ahead and run our application again, what we're seeing is the results of that. We're serving up an HTML page. Let's handle this a couple of different ways. I'm going to go ahead and add a new file, which is going to be an XML file. And I just want to use students.xml. So I'll have a students tag, a student tag. Each student will have an ID and a name. And then I want a couple of students. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste those student objects. So we'll have 4 students, each with different IDs. And I'm going to leave the name the same because it doesn't really matter what the data is. So this is our students.xml file. If we go back to our app.js file, we can change this file name. So we want to read from an XML file now. So students.xml. So that's the content that we're going to have. And if I run this right now, what we'll see is that we have that XML. Okay, so I'm going to run it, and now you'll see different data. Okay, if you're seeing this data, what's going on though is my browser serving this data up. It's the XML data from that XML file. It's serving it up though as though it's HTML. And the way I know that is if I view the page source, I can see the XML. And what's happening is because the browser thinks it's HTML, it's ignoring the non-HTML tags, the XML tags, the students tag, the student tag, the ID tag. So it's ignoring those, and it's just outputting the plain text. So the browser's rendering all of that XML is just the plain text that's inside the tags that it doesn't know about. Because the browser thinks, if I bring up my developer tools and I look at my network traffic, okay, so I'm just bringing up my network traffic. I have this page that's getting served up, and why am I not seeing the actual request? Okay, so here's localhost. You'll see that I'm doing an HTTP GET, the status code is okay, but what's really important is if I'm looking at my response headers, you can see the content type. The browser thinks it's text/HTML. And that's because that's the default. It's also because that's what I said I was sending. Okay, so I'm no longer sending HTML, I'm sending XML. Okay, and now, because I've let the browser know that I'm going to be sending XML, so I restart this, because I've let the browser know that I'm sending XML, and I can verify that in my request headers, or my response headers, sorry. In my response headers, I can verify that the content type is indicating that the browser is sending XML. And because I've done that, now you can see that the browser is rendering out that content differently. Okay. Likewise, we could read from a JSON file, and we could have our content type being application/JSON. It could be a PDF, it could be an image, it can be any of those things. But we are in charge of indicating, here's what I'm sending you, so that the browser knows how to render out that content. So our web server is going to start to get more and more complicated as we go, but kind of the starting point for our web server that we're building out in Node.js is dealing with files from our file system, and how do we manage those files on our file system.